Hey guys, it's Mr. Mazurkewitz, and in this podcast I'm going to be talking about populations and limiting factors. To start this off, I wanted to just take a quick look at human population, since we after all are humans and it's always interesting to take a look at ourselves. Here's a graph that's showing population growth over the last 12,000 years. So one thing I want you guys to notice is if you look from about 10,000 BC up until only about 2,000 years ago, our population remained pretty constant. It wasn't really increasing that fast. It wasn't until about 500 years ago or so that our population really started to skyrocket and take off, and we can attribute that to things like agriculture and advancements in medication and technology, and because of that our population has been able to increase to over 7 billion today. So when we talk about populations and these things called limiting factors, I want you to think back about population growth and how that plays a role with us. Our essential question today is, what are the factors that determine population sizes, and how do these factors determine a population's what's called a carrying capacity? So I underline that term because you might not know it yet, but you definitely will by the end of this podcast. Before we can even start, obviously you want to be able to define what is meant by the term population. So all that a population is it consists of all the individuals of the same species that live together in one place at one time. So here's a picture of the Florida panther, Florida state's official animal, and if you know anything about the Florida panther, you also know that they're endangered. So their population level at this point is really low, below 200, and there's a lot of efforts to try and get that population back up so they don't go extinct. So what sort of things cause populations to change? If we take a look at our Florida panther here, what can cause it to go up and what sort of things are going to cause them to go down? Well, we can attribute population change to four main factors. The first two that we'll talk about are going to be the things that cause populations to go up. So if I have 4 panthers here and the population, let's say, goes up to 7, how is that possible? Well, one thing that should come to mind are births. Births cause populations to go up. What else could cause a population to go up aside from births? Well, how about if some panthers move into the population? In other words, immigration. So it's these two working together that cause the population size to increase. What sort of things are going to cause my panther population here to decrease? Well, we can get the opposite of births, which is unfortunately death. So if some of these start to die off, the population would fall. And if others just decide they don't like it there and want to move out and go to somewhere else, well, emigration will cause the population to fall. So it's the interaction between births, deaths, immigration, and emigration that really cause populations to change over time. It's worth noting that when births and immigration, so the rates of these things, are higher than deaths and emigration, we would expect the population to increase, and that if deaths and emigration, if those two are higher than births and immigration, then obviously we expect the population to fall. So we're going to take a group of organisms. I'm going to use rabbits now for an example. What happens to populations when they're just in ideal situations? There's plenty of food, plenty of water, plenty of room. What is going to happen to the growth of that population over time? So here we have 3 rabbits, and let's say everything's great. They're in an ideal situation. There's plenty of everything. And let's say over the course of time their population doubles, so from 3 to 6. If things are still great and there's still plenty of resources, and then they double again, that 6 might go to 12, and then 12 to 24, and 24 to 48, and 48 to 96, and you guys get the idea. What you're noticing is that the population is able to increase quicker and quicker and quicker, and if I were to plot this on a graph, it would look a little something like this. This is a type of growth that we call exponential growth. So exponential growth is when the population is growing faster and faster, and we can describe it using what's called a J-shaped curve. The curve on this graph is shaped like the letter J. Again, this is under ideal situations, but we know in reality this is not the case. If exponential growth happened all the time, then our planet would be overrun with not just rabbits, but everything. So eventually something's got to give, and what we get is a different type of growth. So to show that, I'm going to start with my same 3 rabbits, and let's say again, there's plenty of food, plenty of space, plenty of water, and the population again doubles to, let's say, 6, and then 6 increases to 12. What's going to start to happen is, as this population increases, maybe food becomes scarce. They're eating all the grass in the area, so maybe instead of it doubling, maybe only another 6 come in, and then this time only another 3. You start to notice that the population rate is slowing down. Maybe even without so much food, what happens is some individuals start dying, so the population starts to fall a bit. If I were to plot this on a graph, though, this is what we would get. You notice that it starts out the same. It was increasing faster and faster, but eventually it starts to level off. We call this type of growth logistic growth. So logistic growth is that when population growth slows down and eventually levels off, and we describe this not using a J-shaped curve, but what's called an S-shaped curve. You notice that the curve is shaped like the letter S. So to show this a little bit more in detail, I'm going to use a simulator by this company called NetLogo. It's called Rabbits, Grass, Weeds, and this is going to be a simulation that shows us what happens to this rabbit population over time. So I'm going to only start with 5 rabbits in this ecosystem, and all these green boxes here are going to represent grass that the rabbits depend on for food. In a second, I'm going to hit this go button, and you're going to notice these rabbits are going to start running around eating the food, and if there's plenty of food, they're going to start to reproduce, so the population will start to increase. I want you also to focus on this graph here, because you're going to notice what's going to happen over time when this rabbit population gets too high. So here we go. So here you notice that the population increases a lot. It starts to skyrocket in my graph. The red line shoots up exponential growth, but eventually the population drops. They've passed a certain point, and then eventually it starts to level off. They've kind of found their sweet spot in this ecosystem. So I'm going to pause it here and let's just talk about what happened. So again, the population increased, and then right around here where the line goes up and down but kind of settles off, they've reached this limit. And it was due to the amount of food that was available in the area. And we can actually see, well, what happens when I increase the growth rate of the grass? Let's say the grass grows back twice as quick as it did in the previous example. Well, before I start that, you should think to yourself, well, what do I expect to happen to the rabbit population if the grass is growing back quicker? So let's test it out. Now you notice that the line again shoots up, drops down a bit, and again settles at a certain point. And it's going to eventually level off. So we notice that the leveling point is higher because there was more food available, but again, all populations reach a certain point where they level off. Well, what do we call this leveling off point? The term in biology is the carrying capacity. So all that a carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals of a species that can be supported by a particular environment. In this case, the rabbits were limited by the amount of food that were available. Either way, when we take a look at graph of populations, when the population eventually levels off and stops increasing and decreasing, we've reached what's called the carrying capacity. Another way to think about carrying capacity is in terms of birth, death, immigration, and emigration. So if you recall, we said when birth and immigration are higher than death and emigration, the population is going up. When death and emigration are higher than birth and immigration, the population is going down. Well, if my population is not changing at all, what's the relationship between these? Well, we'd say that they are equal. So when birth and immigration are equal to death and emigration, we say that the population has reached what's called the carrying capacity. So what sort of things set the carrying capacity? What is going to make my carrying capacity exist? Well, we get a bunch of factors and we call these things limiting factors. A limiting factor is going to be anything that keeps a population from growing to infinity and overrunning the planet. So in your mind, think about what sorts of things stop a population from growing exponentially faster and faster to infinity. Well, we'll break these things into 2 categories. So we'll start with some abiotic limiting factors, in other words, non-living parts of the ecosystem that limit population growth. So just to name a few, things like climate and weather. So if your climate is dry, you're going to expect the plant population there not to be as high as, let's say, a rainforest. The availability of water and sunlight. Those things also will limit the population and keep it from growing to infinity. Even something like a natural disaster, so if a wildfire breaks out, that's going to cause my population to fall, and it might not be as high as it once was because the ecosystem was destroyed by this fire. It's going to take some time before it to rebound. Even space is a non-living thing, and space always plays a role. In the example of the Florida panther, why is their population so much lower than it was a long time ago? Well, it's because humans have come in and taken over their territory. With all the building we've done, they now have a lower amount of space, so a smaller population. Well, then how about some biotic limiting factors? What are some living parts of the ecosystem that limit populations? Well, just to name a few, humans, we play a huge role in the way that we behave, things like deforestation and pollution. These things limit populations. Diseases and parasites also. If you think about when a population gets really big and gets bigger and bigger, diseases spread more easily from individual to another, and therefore they're going to be limited in how high the population can get to. Food availability, like in our rabbit example, if there's just not enough food, eventually they're going to hit their carrying capacity because there's only so much that can be sustained. So that's really all there is to population. So going back to our essential question, what are the factors that determine population sizes? Again, these are anything that cause higher or lower birth, death rates, immigration, emigration. We call those things limiting factors, and they can be abiotic or biotic. And how do these factors determine a population's carrying capacity? Remember that carrying capacity just means the maximum number that can be supported. So at the point when the population eventually levels off. So if you can kind of name some of these factors and understand carrying capacity, I think you're in good shape. You understand populations, and I hope you guys learned something. Thanks.